We're honored to be joined by Father John Cush, a priest here in the Diocese of Brooklyn, and a huge movie buff, as well as something of an expert in comic books.
In fact, he's taught a class about the history of comic books. So who better to discuss the surge in superhero movies in recent years? Father Cush, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Now, that is a class I would have signed up for.
It really was a lot of fun to teach. It was an elective for the seniors when I was teaching at Cathedral Prep Seminary over in Elmhurst, Queens. And again, they certainly signed up because it wasn't a lot of work and it was an entertaining topic. But I did brought home a really interesting thing for me, that what would be considered rather a geeky thing, and even with the most sports-minded kids, they were genuinely interested in, and it proved that geek culture, if you will, nerd culture, this obscure comic book stuff, the history of the American comic book, it kind of has become mainstream popular culture. And I thought that was an absolutely fascinating thing as an educator and as a priest.
Well, Father, it was a pleasure to have you at the screening of Guardians of the Galaxy last week. You heard our take. What was your thought?
I thought it was a great movie. And again, thank you for having me at the screening. It was a really, really interesting film. It was a lot of fun. Great character development, and as you guys mentioned, it's so funny that the two characters that are probably the most developed among the team are the ones that are all CGI. Really well done. Again, I just wonder if a movie like this could have been made 30 years ago, taking perhaps the most obscure
and bizarre,
yes, of Marvel heroes. I mean, the Guardians of the Galaxy were created as a team in 1968, but this particular group that they're basing on came out 2008. And you would never guess.
Not household names.
No, not at all. And would a movie like this have even been made if it didn't have the Marvel imprint on it? And I'm glad it was made. I really thought it was very well done. Not again for small children. A lot of violence, as you mentioned. A couple of things in there might be a little questionable in terms of the humor, but really well done. So I was really pleased to see it, and I'm happy to recommend it.
Father, the Catholic Church has a long history of engagement with the arts in general and with cinema in particular. But when it comes to comic books, the Church's history is a lot thinner. So the idea of a priest who is a cinema buff or a cinema expert, that's not an unfamiliar idea to many people. But seeing a man with a Roman collar who loves comic books and who has taught classes on comic books, that might be a head scratcher for some people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I sure could. Again, I learned to read as a little kid from comic books. The ideas as a small child of from reading these things of honesty and nobility, of vocation, of triumph over your own selfishness. Think about the stories of Peter Parker. Think of the stories of Bruce Wayne as Batman. The stories of the biblical stories almost of Superman, of Kal-El, going down the streams of time and space, coming to Earth, almost like Moses. These are things that stick in my mind and made me, as a young kid, really start thinking about things beyond just what was in front of me. And again, not for everybody, but I really think comics certainly are perhaps the best written things that are out there in many cases. And as we can see from from so many people that are now embracing the medium of the comic book and the graphic novel.
And that's certainly true at the box office. You know, the sci-fi writer Orson Scott Card, who has actually recently dropped from writing a Superman storyline from DC Comics because of his conservative views about same-sex marriage, once said that fantasy and science fiction is one of the few arenas left where big questions of theology and philosophy can still be explored. Do you think that's part of the attraction for this seemingly unending stream of superhero movies?
I would say it certainly is. I mean, if you think about it, in many ways, the superhero films are our modern mythology, where people in the past would have stories of Hercules, that have stories, and I think you're going to review Hercules very soon. You know, we have our stories of Superman, of Spider-Man, of Batman, of Iron Man at this point, of Captain America, and these people become embodiment. These characters become the embodiment of hopefully of virtues, hopefully of things that we can learn from, and just the sheer entertainment value that are there. Found in these films. I mean, Hollywood is certainly embracing these movies, and shockingly, they're so much better than what most people would assume. They would probably think they'd be pow, biff, bam, you know, of the Adam West Batman TV show of the 60s, but in fact, they're kind of complex, some of these things, and very well written, very well made films.
You know, Father, I think it's really true that in some ways comics at least have the potential to act as a kind of a modern mythology, both in the sense that they are a shared basis of stories that we all know. They give us reference points. We use them to talk to each other about other things. They also give us something of a sense of who we are as a culture. In ancient times, there were the myths of the classical gods and of other pagan mythologies. At an earlier point in the 20th century, perhaps the Western was the great American mythology. But comic books have come to supplant that. And I think of a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, who talked about how myths relate to reality. He said, "By the forging of Graham, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and the moon, root and stock, flower and fruit are manifested in glory." And I think that there's a sense in which Superman and Wonder Woman, at their best at least, can reveal something of the truth about human nature as male and female, set free in a sense from its mortality and from its limitations.
It's the nobility of the human spirit that we can see in these characters when they are indeed portrayed in that. And much like one thing, I mean, it's going to sound really strange, but if you think about it, Batman as a character can be portrayed in so many different ways, and as we've seen, especially in cinema and in television, you could play that character as a dark, brooding, almost quasi-psychopathic character, to the point of the good citizen, example of Adam West from the 60s. And that shows a character that's totally relatable to every culture and every time. And I think that says an awful lot, both as literature and both as exemplar in the moral sense.
You know, I think in our morally confused age, superheroes really present symbols of moral clarity. They remind us of what Faulkner called the old verities, justice, truth, courage, self-sacrifice. And I always remind me of a quote from Flannery O'Connor, who said, "To the hard of hearing, you have to shout, and to the blind, you have to draw in large, startling figures." I think in our morally deaf age, superheroes are those large, startling figures to really sort of shake us out of our moral inertia.
Absolutely. And even to look at, again, to mention the character of Spider-Man, that idea of just triumph over one's own inbred selfishness. He realizes the fault is his. The reason why his uncle dies is his lack of activity, and stopping. Peter Parker could have stopped this character, and yet he chooses not to. He chooses, the immediate good over the ultimate good, which is always to be there for others. And I think these are things that younger people and older people really can relate to. And I think that universal nature of these more basic morality tales that have become more and more complex, and we add layers upon layers upon layers. I mean, we can battle about what continuity are we discussing in terms of different things from Marvel Comics or DC, but it's the same way as people can do that with Tolkien, as people can do that with Star Wars or what have you. But they really are, in the midst of some of the complex aspects of life, they really are basic stories of good and evil, and make people relate to that.
One of the more troubling trends in some superhero movies is this trend towards the dark. I guess it goes back to the works of Frank Miller and his Return of the Dark Knight comic book. I would attribute it in cinema to what I call the Nolanization of the comic book movies. Can you speak a little bit about that sort of trending towards darker themes that I guess really did begin with Nolan, but has really sort of encompassed several other franchises now?
Oh, absolutely. I think in the comics, just to look at that through history, that really was from the 1970s, almost as an antidote to the Adam West Batman. The Biff Pow Technicolor, multicolor things. You had Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil creating this Batman that was really very, very tough, and again, brought up by Frank Miller, and doing that to Daredevil, doing that to Batman. And of course, Christopher Nolan creating these little moral epics in his 3 films. I mean, if we can objectively watch these films and see them, they're not necessarily about a guy that dresses up in a superhero costume. There's stories of redemption. There's stories of falling. failing and getting yourself up, they're incredibly well done. But there is that darkness, that now the flawed hero, to the point of view of, is the hero become the anti-hero? And perhaps in our morally flawed age, as we say, it really has become the norm. And when we do see a hero, for instance, one that is pure and good and, almost your Captain America, if you will, we don't necessarily know how to respond anymore. So even Captain America in the last film, having that crisis of conscience, do I follow, stay straight ahead and follow what my superiors are telling me to do, or we're not used to that anymore, of this pure hero for the sake of being hero. We like the conflicted Wolverine, for instance, the one who has no problem, popping his claws and stabbing and cutting, rather than the Captain America, whose weapon, if you will, is a shield, a defensive weapon rather than an offensive weapon.
One theme that's become even more ubiquitous than the idea of the dark, conflicted anti-hero is the theme of the kind of selfish, immature bad boy who needs to grow up in order to acquire maturity and acquire selflessness, to grow into the responsibility of the powers that have been given to him. This is something that I think started with Robert Downey Jr. in the first Iron Man movie. That movie did it very successfully. I think a lot of the other movies that have attempted the same kind of redemptive arc for the hero have not done it so well. Green Lantern is an example of one that did it a little less successfully.
And I think what worked so well in the Avengers was the juxtaposition of that sort of selfish bad boy Tony Stark versus the greatest generation values of Captain America.
But it really does seem as if there's something that's lacking in these characters that isn't just a heroism. It's a basic moral foundation, a basic outlook on what it means to be a good person.
Right, at that basic human formation that really is required to be a self-authentic person, to be able to be intelligent, to be responsible, to be loving, to be moral, and how to do that. I mean, if you even look at it in terms of a vocation, you can't take it. I've always said this in the work that I've done in terms of vocation and priestly formation. You can't take someone and make them into a priest. Yeah, before you make them into a priest, you have to make them into a Catholic. Before you make them into a Catholic, you have to make them into a Christian. Before you make them into a Christian, you have to make them into a human being. And all aspects of that. And I think that's one of the things with Tony Stark, in Iron Man, and that thing, he learns what it means to be a human being in the midst of all the technology that he has. Peter Parker, another one, to mention that. The idea of the hero being just the perfect person, well, that's really not there anymore, because I think when was the last time that we've had a president that was universally popular, that everybody, no matter what your political perspective, your religious perspective, could just look up to and say, this is a man that I want to be like for no matter what. I mean, we're not used to having a hero.
The whole idea of hero is somewhat foreign in our culture.
Right, absolutely, at this point. So how can we reclaim that? And I think the closest thing that we have to it right now is someone like our Holy Father, Pope Francis, where, again, very popular, but also showing what it means not only to be a religious person, but also what it means to be a fully alive human being. St. John Paul II, another example, and bringing that back to what it means to be a hero in contemporary culture. We need to reclaim that notion of heroism, or reclaim that notion of what it means to be a human being, to be loving, to be attentive, to be responsible, to be kind. In all aspects of our lives. And if young people watch this thing, and not so young people watch these films and can get that out, that's great. But again, as you say, some of the story arcs, again, with Green Lantern, I was just glad it was made. I mean, to see Kilowog on screen, I see Sinestro actually there, that made me happy. The film itself didn't make me so happy, but you know what? It could have been worse.
It's almost ironic that we're talking, early in the history of comic books, there were campaigns against them as being corrupters of youth. And now we're talking about comic book movies being valid modes of communication for communicating values. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Oh, absolutely. If you think of Frederick Wertham and The Seduction of the Innocent, that was the most famous example of this, how comics are basically rotting kids' minds, how Batman and Robin's relationship is that of a very highly questionable adult-child sort of thing, and you have Wonder Woman as examples of sexual perversion and all these different things. And you think about it, what that basically did in the 50s caused the Comics Code Authority to be created, and from there the superhero comics basically collapsed. That's when you started having the ridiculous Batman fighting aliens sort of thing, Superman Red, Superman Blue, and all these other strange stories that writers now like Grant Morrison are taking and adapting and just making completely psychedelic sort of versions of at this point. And it really took Marvel Comics in the 60s to make this, again, the flawed superhero, but not to the extent of a Frank Miller, of course, but to take that back and say, hey, here we have a more realistic version and that people could relate to, that younger people could relate to, whether that be the Fantastic Four, whether that be the X-Men, whether that be Spider-Man, whatever it might be.
You know, Father, when I was a kid reading comic books, I would sometimes get shade from grown-ups talking about the idea of superpowers as being inherently silly. And another interpretation of the appeal of superpowers that I ran into when I grew up was that young kids feel powerless. And so reading about heroes who are powerful makes them feel more secure, and it makes them feel better about the world. Well, a number of years ago, watching the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, watching the Wudang warriors just skipping over the rooftops, floating through the air, the image that Ang Lee created had such a potent poetic beauty that I found myself completely dissatisfied with those kinds of interpretations. And I thought there must be something about the idea of human nature ennobled and empowered in this degree that speaks to us on a very profound level. And for me, it connected to the idea of agility in the resurrected body. And I was very gratified years later to find in the writings of the Catholic writer Stratford Caldecott, who also is a big comic book fan. He passed away recently, but not before seeing the very last Marvel movie to come out in his lifetime, Captain America the Winter Soldier. Marvel sent him a special copy just to him in advance so that he could see it before he died. It was a very sweet gesture on their part, and he had the support of all of the actors in the movie for that to happen. I wonder if you could speak to the various attributes of the resurrected body and how they relate to different kinds of superpowers.
Oh, I think that's a fantastic analogy to make, because in and of ourselves as human beings, we do have those inbred, if you will. We're not going to be flying. We're not going to be, invulnerable to bullets on this plane. But by our baptisms, we're incorporated into Christ, and despite our fallen human nature, we are ennobled. We're deprived of God's grace. We're not depraved in the formation of our own theological anthropology. So, everything that we do right now, we should be aiming on that road home. Where are we going? What's our ultimate journey? Our ultimate journey is to be reunited with Christ, the beatific vision. And the end of time, when all is completed, our bodies will be perfected. What it means to have a resurrected body, we don't know. Perfectly. We don't know what the resurrected body of Christ completely looked like. It's very fascinating. We look at the scriptural passages because, they recognize Jesus. Everyone whom Jesus encounters in the scriptures kind of recognize the Lord at first. They're like, but they don't recognize him. And he always has to kind of prove it's him. Resurrection must make you very, very hungry, because he keeps asking, do you have anything to eat? Do you have anything to eat? Almost to prove that there's a connection between the resurrected body and the earthly body. And I think we do have that inbred thing. How can we use the potential, use the minds that we have, use the abilities that we have now to help build up the kingdom of God, which, as we know, is inbreaking as we speak. And we can do that by becoming transformed in Christ Jesus. We may not be born necessarily with mutant powers. We're not going to be bitten by radioactive spiders. Let's hope not. But or dealt in by gamma rays, super soldier formulas put into us, whatever it might be. But we do have that grace, that inward grace, that sacramental grace that comes through the sacraments, that natural grace that comes from just being alive on this earth, that we can really implement in our lives. And that makes we have the ability to be heroes. And I think that's a great thing.
But there are those four traditional qualities that the scholastics talked about. There's impassibility, for instance, imperviousness to death, disease, illness, and finally death. When you think of that, which superheroes do you think of?
I mean, you could look at so many of them. I'm thinking right now, as soon as you were saying that, in terms of what heroes we could perceive, obviously, in terms of the most one to come to mind would be, of course, Superman. You know, Wolverine, the idea of not dying, of constantly regenerating one's bodies. You know, those are the heroes that would come to mind most automatically. And it's interesting, you brought up the idea of the child feeling powerless and looking to the hero. We were just kind of joking about before about different sort of superheroes, but the character of Captain Marvel with the Shazam being this little boy that says this magic word and becomes this idealized version of what a man should be, this muscle-bound, sort of super strong guy.
Isn't that the fantasy of every young child who's ever felt powerless?
And to do that. So, I mean, can we, if only our kids could see that in Christ himself, if we could look to Christ and see that through the nature of the resurrection, through Christ's the most heroic act of all, Christ's single sacrifice on the cross, his arms open wide, an embrace of love for the world, you know, if we could just see that as the ultimate heroic moment and implement it, that would be incredible. And I think the pathway for culture right now, because everything now, look at the San Diego Comic-Con. This is the biggest media event of the year. And it has very little to do with actually buying and reading comic books. It's all about film, television, games, everything surrounding this culture. If we as Catholics can, as best as we can, infiltrate, if you will, and use these things for us to communicate without being corny, without subverting the artistic message that these various filmmakers, these various comic book writers, artists have, I think we'd be in a much better shape to actually dialogue with the culture as it is. We can't keep thinking that people are going to be turned on by dialogue about classic films, because most of our culture has not seen these classic films, but most of our cultures, members of our culture, have seen the Avengers.
You know, I think that's a really interesting point. Now the tide is definitely turning with the ascendancy of these blockbuster franchises and the popularity of Comic-Con. But for a long time there was a cultural bias against this sort of pop culture, as that it was sort of a sub-geek culture, not taken seriously. The great British compiler of mythology, Bulfinch, wrote in the preface to his great work on Greek mythology that mythology serves no practical value, but it serves a much more important, deeper value in ennobling the human spirit. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about why you think there is that bias against fantasy and pop culture in general, even though, as I said, the tide is turning a little bit. Because it will influence the younger generations. And it always reminds me of the quote from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man that, we create men without chests and expect virtue of them. Well, if all we're teaching in school are facts and practical information and not ennobling the spirit, aren't we just creating a generation of men without chests?
Absolutely. The great theologian of the 20th century, Canadian Jesuit theologian Bernard Lonergan, speaks about this common sense bias that we have, that everything has to be on this level, and we're afraid to look deeper, we're afraid to dig deeper into things. And I think that with these seemingly bright, colorful characters, we can dig deeper and we can relate to them in a very, very different way than perhaps we were able to relate to characters in other types of movies. And I think perhaps if used properly, if the makers of these films really continue on the route they're going, especially the Marvel films, I would say, much more positive. The Disney Marvel universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, really are creating a whole, I think this could be powerful for generations to come, to go beyond just that common sense level, which we need common sense, we certainly do, but the world is more than just the things of this world. To be able to tap in to the world of the transcendent could be a tremendous, tremendous opportunity for us in our dialogue with our culture.
Father, you used three very important words just now. You said, if used properly. Now, we've done a lot of very enthusiastic, comics positive discussion here, but it behooves us to take a look at the other side of the coin also. And a lot of the criticism that comics have taken over the years, let's be honest, there's a lot to say for it. A lot of the writing is bad.
Right.
A lot of the art is bad. And then the problems with comics go deeper than that. There are downsides to the whole mythos, to the some of the underlying themes. Can you speak to some of the dark side of comic books and of comic book movies?
Absolutely. A couple of years ago, my sister was joking with me, said, "You can't read a comic book today," because I was trying to get my two nephews at the time. They were, almost teenager and teenager. I was trying to get them to read comics, and said, "Oh, I think you should read this. Would be a great comic for you to start on." And the notion, and she said to me, "You can't get even into these comics unless you're a 36-year-old geek who's been reading these since you're 10 years old, and you know about Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, and what this one was, and this reboot happened here, and this is not part of continuity." And we've created this sort of thing. And I think part of the danger now, and that I see in the comic book realm, if you will, first in the print and then in the cinema, but they're tied, is we're too concerned. I shouldn't say we, but the people writing comics are way too concerned with what's happening in the cinematic universe and keep implementing that into the comics themselves, to the point, and constantly changing for the sake of changing. And even the idea of political correctness in comic books. I mean, the big news last week was a female Thor. Well, technically she's not Thor, let's be honest. It's going to be a character with the hammer of Thor. The idea of changing Captain America again, even though he disappeared only 4 years ago, tying these in to this, there's just so much change for the sake of change. And so many of the comics that are written at this point, I think, are done for the sake of franchises. How many Avengers comic books need to be published? How many X-Men comic books need to be published? There's no need for 10 X-Men books a month. There's no need for 15 or whatever it is, Avengers books a month. It's almost insane. But I do think that we do see, the stick figure comic character, if you will, the hero that's just really one-dimensional. And we've seen comic book movies like that, where it just doesn't go. I mean, you look at something like the Superman film that could have been just so great in 2006.
Why
Superman
wasn't
Returns.
it?
For me, again, I think it just became too dark. And again, Man of Steel, they just became too dark. I mean, Superman, I don't mean to sound like I'm judging or anything, but Superman having a child out of wedlock, these are things that Superman probably wouldn't do, the character of Superman, as portrayed at least by Christopher Reeves. Christopher Reeve, I should say. Got to correct that, because it's George Reeves and Christopher Reeve.
But I agree. At their best, they can prime the imagination for those transcendent values. Funny you brought up Superman. When we were reviewing the recent Man of Steel, we had mentioned that one survey taken that the two most recognizable symbols on Earth are the Christian cross and Superman's S. And in an earlier conversation we had, you had mentioned that, in your opinion, Superman is the most Catholic superhero. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, again, there's a very interesting website that's called Adherence. I don't know if you guys have seen it. And even the Vatican has mentioned it, the idea of like saying where these characters have been, in terms of their religious faith. And, that's mentioned explicitly or implicitly, and trying to figure out. So Superman, allegedly, in terms of a character, is a Methodist, and Batman is either a Catholic or an Anglo-Catholic Episcopalian. But the truth is, Superman represents, again, Larry Tye has a very good book published by Random House, and I was able to act actually with Andrew Greeley as one of the theological people on that a couple of years ago. But Superman has this sort of positive approach. The world is good. The world is, again, Ernest Hemingway, the world is a good place and it's worth saving. But you never see him, again, a character of pure light, this modern day Apollo, that absorbs the sun and the energies of the sun and is able to transmit that in his brightly colored world to the people whom he meets. He sees the world as fundamentally good, people as fundamentally good, despite the fact that they do commit crime and commit acts of violence. He's able to come and redeem, where, at least looking, for instance, in the Batman films, let's look at Nolan's films for a moment. Batman sees the world as he's willing to fight for it, but the world is a bad place. Gotham is dark. It's dirty. You never see Gotham. Even it's never bright. It never ever is bright, even when they're in the daylight. If you think about whether it be the second film where Bruce Wayne is driving his car around, or the third film where it's snowing. It's kind of like that snow coming down, fighting on the steps of City Hall against Bane. It's just such
Grittiness
a
about it.
Yeah, and I wonder if things become too dark. I mean, it's a difference between your view of humanity and theological anthropology. I would say that the Superman world would see things, the human being as deprived, whereas the Batman film sees the human being as depraved. The villains that they fight against, for instance, I mean, every one of Batman's villains are crazy. They're unstable mentally, and perhaps even the character of Batman himself is, whereas Superman is a pretty well-rounded, good human being.
Well, Father, our time together is drawing to an end, so last question, a two-part question. What is your all-time favorite comic book movie to date, and what are you looking forward to that's on the horizon?
Well, again, both really great questions. And for me, I think back to being 8 or 9 years old in 1981 and going to Kings Highway, the movie theater over there, and seeing Superman 2. Although I didn't really care for its direct sequel, Superman Returns, but Superman 2, that one scene where he brings back the top of the White House and says, "Mr. President, I'm sorry I let you down. I'll never let it happen again." Bringing that whole idea, I mean, that's really the idea of vocation. That's really that idea, like he's discovered what he's called to do in life. So I always will love that movie very, very, very much. And as for what I'm looking most forward to, it really would be Batman versus Superman. As much as I look forward to Avengers 2, but the idea of finally seeing the Justice League on screen, hopefully done very, very well, will be something to behold.
Well, as a longtime DC fan myself, I couldn't have said it better. Father Cush, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Hopefully we'll have you back in the chair when we have some other superhero films to talk about.
Thank you again, guys. God bless you.